Hi, everyone, again. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Elena. I'm with Napa Bookmine. We are so thrilled this evening to welcome virtually, but again to Napa Bookmine, Lisa Napoli, who has a lot of connections here in Napa Valley, especially in St. Helena, where we've worked with her to support the St. Helena Public Library Foundation, and also had events with her books in the past. So this is a wonderful treat to welcome Lisa back. She's joining us from the East Coast tonight. So we're thankful as well for joining us on this late evening for her. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and let Lisa take it away to give us a peek into her new book, Susan, Linda, Nina, and COKIE, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. Lisa, go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm going to mute myself. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here and for that introduction, and a special hello to Maria, who is why I'm even connected to all of you. And I'm so grateful for that. And yes, I am in my late father's study in Boca Raton, Florida. I come to visit my mother since she was widowed a few years ago quite often. And I'm very grateful to be here right now. And I actually wrote a substantial amount of both this book and my last book about CNN, which turns 41 today. Nice coincidence there. We can tie into my last book in this room. And so it's a special place for me, even though it's a strange place for me because I didn't grow up here in Florida. I grew up in Brooklyn. But that said, thank you all for coming tonight. And sorry if I look a little bleary-eyed, but 10 o'clock, wow, usually I'm well in bed by now. But I was so happy to be able to talk with you and tell you about this new book, which is really strange and interesting how it came about. It's when I finished the book about the history of CNN, I said to my editor of that book, Jameson Stoltz, who is the same age as CNN, meaning only 41. He said, you want to write a biography, you said, next, even though I considered the CNN book to be a biography of a place and of a number of people. He said, you want to write a biography? COKIE Roberts had just passed away. Why don't you write a biography of COKIE Roberts? And I looked a little bit into COKIE Roberts. I didn't really know much about her, except that she was an enormously famous person who seemed to die too soon. And she had an enormously interesting background. Agreed, that would be an interesting biography. But then I was talking with a former colleague of mine from public radio. I used to work at this radio show called Marketplace. And I said to this former colleague of mine, I'm thinking about doing this. And she said, no, you should write. She said, dude, she called me dude, you should write a book about the founding mothers. And I said, yeah, that's actually really interesting. So we talked about it. And at first I defined the founding mothers of NPR as Linda Wertheimer, COKIE Roberts, and Nina Totenberg, because they were this triumvirate, and everybody who works in and around public radio knew that they were tight. Then I started researching a little bit more, and I said to another good friend that I was thinking about doing this, and he said, no, you have to include Susan Stanberg, because she was really the original founding mother, and she was arts oriented, whereas they covered inside the Beltway stuff. Susan Stanberg defined the entire network. And frankly, I knew all of their names, but I knew nothing about how they got to be the famous names that we who listened to public radio or worked in it knew. So I started digging and digging and digging, and I decided that actually, wow, I was lucky that this year was NPR's 50th anniversary, and that perhaps that's what I should do. So I called back the editor. The editor said, two thumbs up. Yes, please do that. And you have to do it in under a year. Otherwise, I need to publish it with that anniversary, which was back in May. So little did I know, of course, at that time, nor did anyone, that there was about to be this deadly, crippling pandemic that changed life for everyone, which sadly is good for nothing at all in the world, except that when you're a writer, you're used to living under quarantine as if there is a deadly pandemic out there because you can't go outside. So all of a sudden, the next thing I knew, I was actually, thankfully, headed to a research library in Maryland, where Susan Stanberg had left her papers. Thankfully for me, I spent a week there. Thankfully for me, I went in December of 2019. This is the kind of thing that people will write books about someday, the last thing that somebody did before the world shut down. Then I was back in LA, distilling all this information that I mined from Susan's incredible personal archive, reading all these books, trying to stitch together a story, trying not to freak out about having to write this book so quickly. I was recording the audiobook for Up All Night about CNN in a little studio in Hollywood on the same day that Susan Stanberg got her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and rushed out at lunchtime to watch that milestone, took my notes, went back to the studio. And that was the day, you probably all remember, that the stock market was really crashing as further indication that the world was about to shut down and for the pandemic. And that's when I, for family emergency issues not related to COVID, had to come here to help my mother, and sat in this room distilling all this information and finding more and writing the book, Susan, Linda, Nina, COKIE. And if you know, start firing questions away at me if you like. I don't do a canned presentation. I'm not good at that. And I don't have pictures. There are no pictures in the book, which is a whole other story unto itself. But what I was able to do during this deadly pandemic in the comfort of my mother's back bedroom was to sift through the stories of these 4 women and stitch together their lives, which was parallel to the emerging second wave women's movement of the 70s, which was parallel to the birth of public broadcasting. And lucky for me as a storyteller, you couldn't make that stuff up. It was unbelievable to me as I sifted through all this research and listened to hours and hours of talks from these women and various people associated with NPR in the very earliest days, that Susan and Linda showed up in 1971, right before the entire operation started. Susan ascended to the host chair in 1972, almost by accident. Linda ascended to, or appointed herself, consumer affairs reporter not long after that. They had been hired as behind the scenes players. All the while, the few people who were entrusted with this new upstart network connected to this dead medium radio, which people just didn't care about then, were sort of conspiring to figure out what this public radio thing should be. The whole idea was to be different than than commercial broadcasting, the Walter Cronkite, very professional voice from the mountaintop. So they were all working together to define this sound at the same time that women were emerging from the shadows of the workplace. And it happened to be that women were hired to work in this workplace because nobody else would go to work there. It was this fringy alternative startup. And that was before fringy alternative startups were cool or radio was cool. And into that mix, a couple of years later came Nina Totenberg, a young reporter who was out of work because the place she was working, the print place that she was working, went out of business. A couple of years later comes COKIE Roberts, who was, a young mother, dutiful wife of her husband, who was a journalist, looking to get a job back in DC, really didn't want to be in DC, but her husband's work took them there. All these women came together at this place at this moment in time that is singular. It will never be repeated. There will be never another moment like that. Just like with CNN in 1980, nothing will ever replicate that moment in time. And I had the fun job during this terrible time in American history to sit here and sift through all of that and figure out how to present that story to you. And in the course of it, I learned a lot. I'm in my late 50s. I, of course, knew that the 70s were a time of foment in so many different ways. I was a kid. I didn't really think too much about it. I mean, I knew it was happening. I knew from my mother that women were not equal, that, she as an earner was never seen as equal to my father, even though, in fact, most of their relationships, she earned more money than he did. She was very angry throughout her life. And even after he died, the way the banking system worked, a woman's name was not could never be primary on an account when she was married to a man, or on the mortgage. The house technically belonged to him. So I knew that, but I didn't know what women really went through in the workplace. My parents, had risen out of the working class a bit. I didn't really understand what young journalists were going through in the 70s until I read these women's stories. And it blew me away to learn that these women, who are iconic with media, and still are today, particularly in the case of Nina Totenberg, had a hard time finding work, being taken seriously, put up with all kinds of stuff that now would be called out in a second in a tweet. There they were, landing by accident, and they would all say it was by accident, at this place that by accident happened to become this major media powerhouse known as National Public Radio. So it was an incredibly interesting time. It was a privilege to sift through their stories. I left out the most important part, which is that I was unauthorized when I'd first written to the women in that November, December of 2019. I didn't really think they knew who I was, but I explained that I had this background, that I'd written books. I'd written a book about Joan Kroc, great benefactress of NPR. I had street cred, but they wrote and said, we're not really that interested in talking to you. After mining through Susan's papers and doing a lot of homework, I found a lot of information that I had many, 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 many more questions about. And I started writing to Susan, and I'd say, I saw this, or can you clarify that? Or what do you think about this? And she would always write back and say, I can't believe you found that out. How'd you find that out? I found that out in your papers. You basically left it there, and I happened to be the person sifting through your papers, and I found that information out, and I want to know more. And so because of that, she opened up and started talking to me. And I think she saw that I really meant business, and that I was really digging, and that I wasn't trying to just write a puff piece about anything. I was trying to write a serious story that told the story about the birth of NPR, of which they were all, and particularly her, integral. So that's the book I wrote. That's the book you can buy from Napa Bookmine. I hope you will. And I read it on audio as well. It's ebook too. Buy a hard copy. Support this fabulous bookstore. And if you have any questions, I'm really delighted to answer them. And while I'm waiting for questions to come in, or for Elena to pose a question if she's got one herself, what's so interesting for me as a career journalist to have written these last two books in particular that are deeply researched media history books at this moment in time about where media is so polarizing. You really get a picture. It doesn't explain today in hard terms, but it will help you understand how we got here today if you look at the media history. And of course, I hope you'll read my media history, but media history in general will illuminate for you this polarizing world that we live in now. Okay, we do have a question from Nancy. What is the story of not having photos? So the problem was that when NPR started, it was underfunded. There was very little money. Nobody really wanted to fund it in the first place. That whole story is in the book. And it wasn't like on that first day, same thing with CNN, that there was a photographer hired to take pictures, because nobody knew that when All Things Considered launched, that it would last or what it would become. So there's no day of photos. And the photos I found of these women from the 70s were incredibly impossible to source copyright wise. And of course, when you publish something on a website, it's one sort of risk if you put it up there and you don't own it, which I, as a copy creator, am extremely respectful of. But a publisher really won't take that risk of publishing photos. So we could find photos, of course, of them in a contemporary sense, but we wanted to show the pictures of them younger. And we went back and forth with several people who did have photographs that we could find during the pandemic from their personal files, but we could not come to terms on licensing them. So the publisher who ultimately makes these decisions decided not to include them. That's the story. So I've gotten some angry mail from people about not having pictures. My editor, said, oh, well, they can look them up, which I don't think is necessarily fair. But in the CNN book, we found a guy who actually was there on the day one, who was a young production assistant who came in, even though it wasn't his day of work, with a camera, and has been sitting on these pictures for 40 years. No one ever wanted them. He tried to sell them a few times. Unfortunately, that never happened with this book. Barbara Smith says, thanks for writing this book. I missed all the historic connections. I was a young woman in the 70s. So this is like reading my history and how all of it's connected. She loves the book. Thank you so much, Barbara. And yes, that's what I love to hear, because like everyone on earth, I haven't really stitched together those things until you step back and have the time to step back, even if it's a year and a half, to figure out how to synthesize all that information. And that's a huge compliment, and exactly what I was hoping you would say, because I want everybody to say, wow, I can't believe that all those things were going on at one time, just as public radio and public broadcasting in general was beginning. The problem was that commercial broadcasting, some of you may remember, was so polarizing in the 70s. People were so worried about this nefarious force that had this stranglehold on the American mindset. Entertainment, news, 3 networks dominated everything that you saw. And so when public broadcasting was created in the late 60s, it was such an exciting moment in time for this country that the president identified the need for an alternative voice. And we talk today like crazy about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, they realized that in the 60s. Unfortunately, it got derailed along the way. It didn't get embraced the way it needed to in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, except on some levels at some local stations. But the network out of the gate wanted to be different, sound different, employ different people, which is why women had opportunities. They wanted to hire a Black co-anchor, of all things considered, in 1971, which was really nothing short of revolutionary. It was so hard to hear voices other than those 3 august white men. And it just, things detoured, but they did try.
There is, if I could just interject really quick, Donna, I think, had a question right at the beginning that we both missed.
Oh, missed, okay.
Did you become authorized eventually by all 4 women, or was it just Susan?
Well, COKIE is deceased, so she couldn't authorize me. NPR never authorized me, and in fact has not really wanted to talk much on national public radio about the book. I've been on a number of local shows, but there's some twists and turns in the plot that I don't think NPR loves. And, like most corporations, if they didn't sanction it, they don't want to endorse it. And then, I'm sorry, so the beginning, so the 3 women did ultimately start talking with me and interacting with me. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, a sign that they endorsed it is they started doing events with me. I've done a number of events with them where they've been incredibly complimentary about the books, even though the books are not 100% rah-rah, these women are perfect. So I feel very honored that they have the maturity to see that this book was important to be written, because it does reflect accurately the time in which they lived and the foibles that they encountered or that they created for themselves along the way. So yes, they did get involved. Sue is asking about public money and contributions, but how did it get its start financially? So when President Johnson said, let's create public broadcasting in 1967, initially, the people who wrote that bill wrote it as the Public Television Act, because as we said before, they were trying to combat the menacing force of commercial television. And there were a small number of people around the country at non-commercial stations licensed mostly to universities, educational radio it was called, who said, we got to put radio in this act. And the people writing the bill said, no, we'll get to radio later. We got to just get television out of the gate. And the radio people, this small but fierce group of people working in non-commercial radio, meaning the stakes were low. There was not money in it for them. They were all underfunded. They had less than $25,000 budgets, mostly volunteers. But these people were passionate enough about radio that they fought to get radio pasted in to the Public Television Act and made it the Public Broadcasting Act. And at the beginning, they allocated $5 million for public radio. Not a lot of money even back in 1971, when you're trying to figure out a way to get local stations around the country professionalized enough, good enough signals so they transmitted widely enough to be able to carry a nightly network news show. And basically, the system is a little bit too complex to explain here. I get into it in the book. But in the beginning, the system was set up so that NPR, the mothership out of Washington, D.C., would transmit this one show to member stations. There were only 90 that qualified to begin with. And during the time of a financial crisis that I write about in this book in 1982-83, where NPR almost shut down, in the aftermath of that, they changed the financial model that resembles the model we have today. So when you give money to KQED or wherever you give money, you're not giving money directly to NPR. You're giving it to a member station who then writes a big check or small, depending on what market they're in. It's a sliding scale, to NPR to purchase the shows that are national that you hear. They get a minuscule amount of public funding at this point. The stations get slightly more if they're in more rural areas, because the idea is to be able to empower them to reach people who would not hear them otherwise. So it's a very complex ecosystem, and I don't mean to gloss it over here, but it is a very complex ecosystem, and it's very important that you look at where you give any money charitably, I think, and understand where it's spent and how it's allocated. But it's a myth that the public radio system is given a massive sum of money. That said, public radio is a very rich institution. National Public Radio is a very rich institution, in part because Joan Kroc left it hundreds of millions of dollars on her death in 2003 that endowed it. And any of you who understand endowments, and I'm sure you do, it changed the game for NPR. So as I say, it's a complex economic ecosystem, and it's poorly understood by even the people who work there. So someone wants to hear about common threads between the women's stories that resonated the most with me. Okay, well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Stephanie. And thank you for buying the book from Bookmine. What was so interesting to me is that these four women's lives were very, very different. Two of them were from what we would call the working class. Susan Stanberg, Linda Wertheimer. Susan grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan before it was a fancy place. And her father was a salesman. She was the first person to go to college in her family. She was from a very small family. And she got a scholarship that enabled her to transfer from a local school to a private school, Barnard. Linda Wertheimer is the daughter of a grocer in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and she won a National Merit Scholarship. She won every scholarship in her school. She was just a, brilliant student. And she would have gone to school probably in New Mexico if somebody hadn't met her along the way and said, if you want to if you want to achieve, you really should get out of here and go to the best possible school you can. And this woman steered her toward the Seven Sisters, and she applied and got into Wellesley. And she talks about going from Carlsbad, New Mexico in the 60s to Wellesley, which at any time is a culture shock, but particularly was then. The other two women, Nina and COKIE, were from fancier families. Nina's father was a concert violinist, world-renowned, Holocaust survivor, an incredible person who taught until his last breath at 102, I believe it was. He was an educator at BU at the end of his life, or in the last decades of his life, but he performed all around the world for kings, for the Roosevelts. He was an amazing person. COKIE's parents were both lawmakers. Both her father and then her mother, after her father died an untimely death, were served in Congress, and her mother's from a wealthy family. Her father was not, but COKIE grew up in this incredible family. So what is the commonality of these four women? They entered a world where women were told being smart and educated wasn't good enough. But they also didn't deal with being told no. They were told no a lot. And they pushed back against it as much as they could at the time. Then once they all got in the door, literally and figuratively at NPR, they all banded together. They became dear friends with each other, but they also helped each other, helped others as well as each other. And they made it their mandate to help other people because they knew how hard it had been for them. So there's a lot of nuance in their stories that I'm leaving out, of course, but those are the things. I found it so fascinating that four people from such different backgrounds could come together at the same place and connect with each other so deeply. We've all made friends at work, but they made dear, dear friends. There's my friend Jennifer Becker, who got me involved with all of you to begin with. Thank you, Jennifer, publicly. Okay, how did writing this book compare with writing my other books for me personally? Well, this book, given that it was written during the pandemic, of course, like everything that's happened in the last year, will stick out in my mind differently than everything. But this book was different because I actually didn't set out to write it. My Joan Kroc book, I had this experience in Santa Monica covering a peace sculpture that was in disrepair, and had this idea that I would write about the benefactress of that, who happened to be Joan Kroc, and spent 5 years of my life just digging to find out more about her. My first book was based on going to the Kingdom of Bhutan because of some cute guy I met at a cocktail party. That was interesting. And I sat down and I wrote a book proposal. I wanted to write a book about it. But this book I did not intend to write. It really came about because this editor said, why don't you write a book about COKIE Roberts? And yet I loved doing it because it was a fabulous assignment, or partial assignment, that forced me in the best way to learn about a moment in time in history that I just really probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So the process of digging and researching and continuing to dig and researching and synthesizing some more and researching is all the same. And I love it. And it's crazy and it's all consuming. And if I look tired, we're all tired, we're all busy, but it's an all-encompassing exercise that is just joyful for me, especially when someone says that it illuminates a period of time in history that maybe they lived through that they just didn't realize. And hearing Susan Stanberg say, wow, I totally forgot about the fact that I'd pitched a woman's show to NPR before I was the host of All Things Considered. I was trying to get on the air more, and I came up with this idea of a woman's show, and they didn't have the resources to let me do it, but she'd totally forgotten that. So that's really fun, is when someone says something like that to you. I'm sure there are other questions. Have I missed any, Elena, or is there
Not
other?
in the chat box. I did have sort of a question for you, though.
Sure.
I'm so interested in the trajectory of your writing career from kind of journalism to, I called it in my notes, media historiography. So historiography is the study of history. Media historiography, which I just made up, and I'm sure there's a better term for it.
I love that. I'm going to steal that.
The
Good.
study of the history of media broadcasting. I'm interested. I mean, do you hope to continue with that kind of thread in your research and your writing of looking at sort of the history of media and how we've studied media as well? Do you want to get back to kind of the more journalistic type stuff that you did earlier in your career? Cool, I'll let you talk then.
No, that's a great question. I love stepping back at this stage of my life and looking at this time that I've lived through and experienced to some extent, and reflecting on it and synthesizing it and trying to make sense of it. When I was researching the book about CNN, up all night and understanding the power of satellites, which sounds kind of like a snooze unless you're into that sort of thing, and how it changed everything about how we're communicating. Like, for instance, what we're doing right now. This light bulb went off for me. I had the privilege of working at the New York Times in the late 90s, after working at a couple of early web startups that failed, high funded by Murdoch and other people. And actually one was a home shopping channel by Barry Diller, but that's a whole other story. But I had this very strange and wonderful, not necessarily lucrative nor, expansive. Like, I didn't, like Linda Wertheimer, walk into a place and spend 50 years there. But I've worked for these series of places that were at a pivotal moment in media history without even really completely grasping it. And when I went to work for the New York Times for a website called Cyber Times, that was the first New York Times on the web offering, and we were getting mail from all around the world in the late 90s from early adopters who were desperate and hungry to read stuff on the web, because there wasn't that much there then. If any of you were on then, and they were turning to the New York Times because that just sounded like something, I better find something I know. And they'd find us, and we were writing about this exciting moment in history. It was a thrill. I just love that. And one day I hope to write a book about that. It's not long ago enough yet to reflect on that moment in time where everything changed into this digital universe that we now inhabit every single day. The way I always say, this is a TV studio now. And on the first day of CNN, you needed a giant studio. Right now, what I'm focused on, I'm going a little bit further back in time on April 9th, 1939, and bonus points if anybody can tell us in the chat what I'm probably writing a book about if you look up April 9th, 1939. So I'm going to step back a little bit further to the genesis story of something else. But I do love and think it's extremely important that we teach children and each other about the history of media and how we got to where we are in interesting and engaging ways. None of this is polarizing. These places are polarizing. People hate CNN. I had a very hard time selling the CNN book, because if I was writing a CNN versus Fox book, like my friend Brian Stelter did, I would have sold it for $1 zillion. But I didn't. I wrote the history, and I just think it's so interesting because a smart, thoughtful person can read it and say, wow, okay, now I see that before there was 24-hour news, even though I remember it, I was alive. Wow, before that, certain things just were not possible. And that will be the same thing one day when I write about the internet. Okay, I'm going to work my way up from the questions. What were the sources you used in writing this book? Well, in the back of the book, I list them. Dozens and dozens of books, hundreds and hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles, dozens and dozens of conversations and lectures, on cspan.org. By the way, if you're ever super bored or interested in something, there are thousands of hours of really old archival footage on C-SPAN that's mind-blowing. So many, many hours of conversations on C-SPAN from the 70s. Actually, there was stuff from the 60s on C-SPAN there. Martha Griffiths was a representative from Michigan who was instrumental in getting women attached to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Susan Stanberg's archives, as I mentioned before, personal archives, which are expansive and formidable and enormously helpful, as well as other broadcasters involved with the early days of NPR left their papers to this. It's called the Hornbeck Special Collections at the University of Maryland. It's a broadcasting library. It's open to researchers. Huge, really interesting and wonderful place. So a number of sources, as well as talking to several dozen people. As I've learned writing books, and anybody out there who writes or is interested in writing either biography or memoir, I'm going to get a master's right now in biography and memoir because I love the subject so much. Anybody who writes it knows that memory is fallible. So if I ask you and your husband and 10 other people about one pivotal day, your wedding day, the birth of your first child, whatever, you will all have different memories of that first day, even though you were all there. And over time, those memories get softened or focused or clouded by other memories and things and facts and ideas that get repeated over time. So when you write these kind of books, you want to do a blend of human and archival, because there's no way to ever know absolutely for sure. And in my business, you're only supposed to say something if 2 or 3 people have repeated the same thing. And if they don't repeat the exact same thing, you sort of say, well, she said this and he said that. There's always going to be mistakes along the way, but that's our job, is to synthesize through all that stuff and figure out what really happened. And as I say, I can't tell you what really happened if I wasn't there, but if I was there and 5 other people were there, we'd all have different takes on it anyhow. So it's a synthesizing process. It's really, really fun. Barbara said, thanks for including online video references within the chapters. Use some as I read. Henny said, you started with Susan Stanberg's papers that she donated to the Hornbeck Special Collections, this broadcasting library. And what sources? Same question. What sources other than person-to-person interviews? And again, when you do an interview with someone, I can sit down and say, tell me about, I'm just using wedding day because that's a monumental day in people's lives. I can say, tell me about your wedding day. That's kind of a bad question. The better question is, you wore a taffeta dress from Vera Wang on your wedding day. Tell me about going to buy that wedding dress. Or tell me why you didn't wear a wedding dress on your wedding day, or tell me how you chose the flowers that I see were on your table from your wedding day. Those are the better questions. So one interview is never enough. You have to keep going back with all these specific questions. What did I ask Nina Totenberg a couple times? Oh, Nina Totenberg, growing up in Scarsdale after her parents moved to the suburbs, happened to have gone to school with the child of Judy Garland, Liza Minnelli, and they were in a school play together. And so I kept saying to Nina Totenberg, you were in this school play. It was a Diary of Anne Frank, and Liza Minnelli played Anne Frank. And I kept saying to Nina, you know, the papers say X, Y, Z about the set, and the cast was going to travel. It was such a great production. And she kept saying, absolutely not. That's not true. This part's not true. Yes, the production happened. So there's all kinds of little details like that happen that trigger people's memories or trigger them to think, no, that's wrong. Somebody wrote to me recently who was a pivotal character in the book, but a small character, who helped choose Frank Mankiewicz, the third president of NPR. And he said, oh, no, you got that hotel wrong. The hotel where we chose Frank Mankiewicz as the NPR board of the third president, that was not the right hotel. I said, well, 3 other people said it was that hotel, and you say it's this hotel. So I can fix it. So then when the next edition comes out, I can say, note, Edward Elson says that's not the hotel, but 3 other people said that hotel. And the minutes of the NPR board meeting from that time said that hotel. So that's a kind of crazy, wacky little detail that people who write these kind of books have to write, which is why fiction, it's not easier, but it's better if you could make stuff up, which don't have the constitution. Challenge of writing about 4 major individuals in such a short time, not advisable. Although anybody who's ever worked on a deadline, which is most of us, know that deadlines are good and it forces you to get something done. But yeah, it was a challenge. I was working 15 hours a day. It's not healthy. I like balance and I didn't have any, but as I said before, it was during the pandemic. So it wasn't like I was missing out on a beach party. Not that I probably would have gone anyway, but yeah, it was a very, very challenging time, but a rewarding one, because as I was discovering information, I realized it was hopefully going to amount to something interesting. So I keep talking too much. Anything
Any other
else?
questions? Has anybody figured out what Lisa's working on? 1939?
Yes, here's somebody.
Wait, we have somebody in the chat. Okay, Kathleen. Who Googled it?
Yes, Marian Anderson. I don't know who knows or remembers. I don't think anybody's probably old enough to remember. Maybe Marian Anderson gave a landmark concert at the Lincoln Memorial on April 9th, 1939, which is considered to be the birth of the modern civil rights movement. And she gave that concert outdoors. She was probably one of the most, arguably the most famous singers in the world. She gave the concert outdoors because she was barred from appearing indoors in Washington, D.C., which was still a segregated city in 1939, and she happened to be Black. So it is a really interesting story to look at how she came to be there in the first place and how this controversy erupted about her being barred from appearing inside Constitution Hall on April 9th, I think the April 9th was the original day they'd asked for. So I'm just in the early stages of researching it yet. I haven't sold the book, so don't steal the idea. But if you steal the idea, I'm sure you'll do a better job or a different job. So, but yeah, I'm just researching that right now because I'm completely captivated by how that date occurred, how her life occurred. So, it's kind of a media story, but it's not pure. But one day down the road, I'll write that New York Times, Cyber Times story. It's good.
I am curious, so curious. I mean, it does seem like media and media literacy has suddenly become an incredibly important education item.
Yes.
And maybe I'm wrong in that it's sudden, but it does seem that the internet has really accelerated that. Though I think anybody who kind of studied, we all learned, was it the yellow press way back in the day of the early papers, that this streak has sort of always been there of sensationalism. People love to watch the train wreck. And you, of course, have now been in it and studying it. And I'm just really curious about where you kind of see the future of media going.
Wow, if I knew, I would be working over at Google trying to fix it all. I don't know. I think it's the same. The dialogues that we're having are the same dialogues. They're just framed differently by the technology. People misrepresented stories for years. There was point of view for years. It used to be before there were electronic media, you would, there would be a number of newspapers in town. I don't actually know how St. Helena was, a smaller town would be, but there'd be usually a number of papers in town that had points of view. And you read this one if you agreed with that point of view, or that one if you agreed with that point of view. So there's always been polarizing media, just like there always have been polarizing people. But it is fascinating to look at this mid 20th century or mid to late 20th century phenomenon as electronic media really took hold and changed accelerated everything. Like I say, I think it's always been there. Someone was posting pictures of the Tulsa race riot or massacre, more accurately, which is today. I mean, an anniversary is 100 years ago today. And someone posted a picture of the media, the headline in the aftermath. And it basically says, 2 white people died or something like that. I can't remember how many white people exactly died, but it completely does not acknowledge that hundreds of Black people died and thousands of houses were burned down, or 1,200 houses. So I was watching it with my mother on American Experience last night, and even my 84-year-old mother didn't know about this massacre until recently because it wasn't articulated in the press. So it is so interesting to go back and look at that. And it really, when I was in college in the early 80s, we were assigned this book by John Berger, Ways of Seeing. It wasn't media literacy so much as it was trying to teach you how to look at different images and how you and I will see those images differently. And I think that's, I hope people are learning that and teaching that. That's a really important. My first book is about how I went to Bhutan at the dawn of democracy. We started this radio station there that was supposed to transmit information about this new democracy. But of course, it became more of a pop music station instead. And now, 10 years later, the whole place is about Facebook and posting pictures of your tattoos. And it's so interesting to see what's happened there. And yet there were people at this dawn of media culture in Bhutan saying, we have to teach the young people how to parse this, how to make sense of it. But I don't know how far that's actually gone, sadly. In taking classes, are you feeling that you know the course material? Are you learning things? If so, what? Thanks for doing this. Okay, I loved going to school. I wish I'd been as good a student as I hope I am now, back when I was actually more traditional student age. And yet people kept saying, how could you have written these books and feel like you should go to school, which is a nice compliment. But it really, you learn so much when you're reading something that you are not, that you're assigned, and that you're learning from the dialogue of 15 other people from their various points of view and their conversations about it. And it helped inform my choice of this next topic that I'm working on, and informed my look at how I read and critically read. I loved the assignments. I got an A on my final paper. I was so excited. I wrote a biography of a man I stalked on Instagram who I don't know. And I was so excited. I got that idea from sitting in class every week in this format. So I absolutely loved it. And what a gift. It was such an incredible experience. Comes to mind questions of future of media. Susan and Nina were referring to the threat of podcasts in another event I did. Podcasts, whenever someone I know talks about the podcast industry and the explosion of podcasts, I think back to when I was at the New York Times in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then I went to MSNBC, and everybody was freaking out about the web, and the web was going to kill everything that we'd known on the planet beforehand. It was going to eradicate all other media, which of course it hasn't. It has changed everything. It's same thing with podcasts. You know, the biggest producers of podcasts, the most financially successful producers of podcasts are the people who made the traditional media. NPR, I don't remember where they are in the ranking, but they're one of the top producers of the podcasts. So it's all consolidating. You know, there will always be creative stuff, but they're always going to be big guys. Sadly, they're usually guys. Guys are great. I don't have anything against them, but usually the big purveyors are big companies because they've got the money, and ultimately comes down to money. You can't make podcasts that are really good that people want to listen to unless there's a budget, just like you can't make movies. Yes, every once in a while there's an indie movie that comes along and blows everything out of the water. But usually the blockbuster movies are the big budget ones. Sadly, that's what's happening with podcasts. It's all consolidating. It will consolidate more. All these people are going out and getting experience in that world. It's great. Good for them. Cash the check while you can, and be prepared for the place to fall apart, because a lot of them do. I had that experience in the internet era, and I saw many people I know leave good, comfortable, stable jobs to go take the risk and the big bucks at this other place that never went anywhere. And some of them did go somewhere. You know, think about Ira Glass. Ira Glass left NPR, where he started his career, because it was going too mainstream newsy for him. This is decades ago. And he started this little show called This American Life. And now he's a podcast empire unto himself, and people love him. He's terrific. But he and Malcolm Gladwell and the other people like that are not doing that without the benefit of big bucks behind them. And, you know, it'll become more celebrity brand oriented. New York Times has this whole podcast studio. It's all celebrity, journalist, brand oriented. Good for them. Good for the people who are cashing in. But there's ads, and there'll always be ads. That's what drives it. So, curious about the theme of the Instagram man I wrote about. He lived in the neighborhood that I grew up in Brooklyn. And I've been wistful for home. And by accident, I found this person whose name is, if you want to look him up, Kensington Doug 56. I will never publish the story while my family is alive, which is hopefully a long time. But basically, this man lives in Kensington, Brooklyn, which is the neighborhood where I was first born in Brooklyn. And he walks around these neighborhoods that I grew up in. And I was looking, I think probably at some friend from childhood who lives in that neighborhood still. And somehow it branched out to this guy. And I've been looking at his feed for a long time, and he reveals just about everything. So he made it easy for me. So thank you for asking. It was fun.
That's a very clever project.
I thought it was
also a lesson in how comfortable people are giving information about themselves to the anonymous many.
Speaking of media literacy, and this guy's 65, but yeah, if you want to teach your teenager not to, and some people I know have teenagers who, the body parts that I see of these, you know, cute little girls I once held hands with, and now they're wearing bikinis in exotic locations, shock me. But this guy isn't one of those. I have a friend from high school whose daughter is extremely brilliant and is going to Cambridge or Oxford or something for graduate school. And the pictures I see freak me out. It's just amazing. She's gorgeous, but still it amazes me. But this guy is not like that. And he has revealed so much about his personal life on his Instagram feed. It's shocking. And because of what he revealed, I was able to find out more. And if I was nefarious, I don't know what I would do. I'm not nefarious, so I can't think of something bad that I would do. But I did just write 20 pages about his personal history based almost entirely on what he revealed on his Instagram feed.
Wow.
And I don't think I don't think I'd ever show it to him, but he knows he's doing it. It's not a private feed. He knows that he doesn't know who I am, but I'm following him. I'm one of 1,000 or so people who follow him. Yeah, scary. So,
oh man. Any last questions or comments for Lisa?
There's one private message here. And I'm going to just try to address it really quickly because it's interesting. Women who may be championing the reality of prevalence and ease of young people to access violence and pornography. No, I do remember 25 years ago, my best friend in Greensboro, North Carolina, had a 4-year-old boy. And that was 25 years ago when we were talking about guns and children and the ill effects of giving guns to children. And she tried to block her kid from having a gun. And then he picked up, a lip gloss and started shooting with the gun, the lip gloss. And I don't mean to make fun of that because it's the violence in video games issue and the impact of television on everybody's psyche is enormous. And I don't know who's written about that, but I'm sure there are people who have. I know that Gina Davis, the actress, Geena Davis, does a study about the depiction of women in the media and how that impacts women. But I don't know exactly who's doing that. I'm sure there are people who are studying the impact of media and pornography and violence on us all. I mean, there are sadly homeless people assaulted in downtown Los Angeles where I live, and they usually trace it back to somebody who's been watching too many violent video games. So, but thank you for your questions. Thank you all for being so here. I appreciate it. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Again, Lisa Napoli, who we are so delighted to have back with us, even though it's not in person, but
One day.
virtually with Napa Bookmine and Main Street Bookmine. And this program is also in collaboration with the St. Helena Public Library. So I want to thank them as well so much. They've been wonderful partners with us long before we opened the bookstore in St. Helena. So we are very happy to be working with them. And with Lisa, and her book is available at all of our stores. You can order online, napabookmine.com. We ship, we deliver, or come in and pick one up. Say hi to Liza in Napa. Say hi to us down here in Napa. Liza in St. Helena. I know the names. Thank you all so much. This was such a wonderful evening. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
My
very
pleasure.
Late. It's now 11 o'clock there, so let's let her go to bed.
No, I feel excited. It's so exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Great. Have a wonderful evening to you all.
Bye, you guys. Thanks so much.
Bye, Lisa. Bye, Elena.
Hi. So good to see you guys. Thank you.